Good morning, y'all. Welcome to a discussion of our penultimate text, Kyle Baker's Nat Turner. We'll read this for week 5 as well as Day Tripper. I'm asking you to read both of those. If you have read Nat Turner already, you know that it is a relatively quick read. Most of the book is wordless, and what words there are drawn from historical sources. So there are a few words, such as when Nat yells run and things like that are kind of ambient, that come out of the characters or describe noise that happens within the scene, but there isn't a lot of description or exposition here in a visual or in a linguistic form. However, we do get a ton of it in a visual form. Day Tripper is a bit more of a traditional comic in that it relies on text as well as images, but if the ratio in Nat Turner is like 85-15, 85% of the narrative relies on images, 15 on text, that is more like 50-50 in Day Tripper. So I hope that asking you to read two things isn't too much. And there are also two great novels, I think, that are important and that might give you more things to read. If you like Day Tripper, Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba have done a bunch of different things, and Kyle Baker's been in the industry for a long time, for nearly 30 years, I believe. So let's jump into Nat Turner. This is 2006, like I said. It is a retelling of a historical life of Nat Turner, who was a slave in Virginia in the early 19th century and who led a rebellion in 1831. Its genre is at least partially related to the genre of the slave narrative, and we have many examples of that, such as narratives in the life of Frederick Douglass, incidents in the life of Slave Girl. And if you look at page 212 of Nat Turner, of the book you have in front of you, you'll see a bunch of further suggestions for reading if that's something that you are interested in. And if you click this link here, you can go and read the original version of the Confessions of Nat Turner that was published in 1831, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So this text, the features of this particular text of Kyle Baker's Nat Turner, just be warned, it's brutal, it's violent, it shows a lot of the violence that was endemic to slavery. It holds no punches, and some that may be potentially upsetting to some folks. I'm going to attempt what's called a formalist analysis, and I would encourage you to do as well, is to close read the features of the text, to try to make sense of how it does what it does or why it might do what it does. This is the methodology closely related to close reading, right? So in a normal literary analysis, you would draw quotes from a text. If you're looking at a comic, you can draw quotes as well, but you can also analyze specific pages, specific panels. I'll talk about what that term means in just a minute, and the kind of visual features of the text in ways that are really similar to what you do when you close read a traditional print novel. Some other features of the text is that it is in black and white throughout. There is no color, although there is some like sepia-toned passages. There's a little bit of brown wash and gray throughout, but it's mainly black and white. I explained that there's minimal text, and we call this book, I think Kyle Baker calls it Nat Turner to distinguish it from the 1831 Confessions of Nat Turner. This is a sample page that we get from the second chapter called Education. So when you'll notice when you're reading a comic, you have to change how you read in certain ways, but you don't have to change how you read in other ways from a traditional print piece of literature. You still generally start at the top left of the page, so here, and then you go right, and then you go down left and right, like you would on a sentence in a normal traditional print novel. Kind of scan the page as you normally would and read it according to that normal kind of layout or flow of a text. Each of these images is called a panel, and then it's separated by this white slice here, which is called a gutter, right? So panel, gutter, panel, gutter, panel, gutter, panel. And so each of the panel in a comic book is not just a image, it's a moment in time. And we can also kind of move forward in time as we read this particular page, right? So we've got Nat Turner looking into a schoolroom. We see the white schoolmaster and the white pupils learning their ABCs, and the door slammed on him. So this is physically slamming the door on him, but also metaphorically. He's cut off from an education. He's cut off from the kind of literacy that will enable him to reach the kind of next level, as we see throughout the novel, that he uses his reading to do that. And then we see, when you're reading this, you really have to pay attention closely to the images. I think our first impulse when we're reading a comic is to just go quickly. There's images, there's no words really. We can go as quickly as possible, but look at the look on his face. And then look how it changes here. And I think Kyle Baker's being very specific in what he's trying to show us through this page and through these panels, right? So we see he's fascinated here. The door slammed in his face. Then he looks a little angry, and now he looks scared, but he's defiantly putting his ear up to the door because he wants to read. He wants to have the education that other people have. He wants the education that's been denied to him by systems of oppression and slavery. So we can really kind of close read this just like we could a traditional novel. It's just that we're talking about images rather than language. So we might pay attention to panel size and placement. Some pages will just be one big panel. Some pages will have a lot of smaller panels. And I think that, the size of the panel sometimes tells us how much time we are supposed to take looking at that, how much of our attention it is supposed to take up. So if we look at that big full page spread on 135, for example, this is a really brutal scene in which the young boy is being decapitated. And it is an entire page. And I think that's Kyle Baker saying, slow down, look at this, pay attention to it. Not only that, but recall back to 108, where we see that same young boy being waved at and kind of smiled at by the slave who decapitates him. So there are lots of things to do with a comic, and these are just a few things that you might pay attention to as you're reading. Time's really important, I think, in this book, and we often see sun and moon imagery. I'm going to fast forward to the next slide for just a second. Sorry for the quality of this image. I'm sure most of you are thinking, I can't believe this guy still doesn't know how to do PowerPoint that doesn't look awful. But this is this image here is the passage of time. So we see the moon, I think, moving through its phases. And that passage of time, I think, is important both because it tells us as a reader time has passed between the first image on this page and the next one when you see that sun and moon sequence, but also because the eclipse is such an important part of the text, right? That's when Nat says that he learned that he needed to go on his errand, right? That he needed to lead a rebellion was because of that eclipse. So as time moves forward, we see that, but also we're constantly reminded of the greater purpose of Nat's rebellion. The historical Confessions of Nat Turner was recorded by Thomas Gray, who was a white attorney who represented several slaves from that rebellion. And you can read the historical account here. I'd encourage you to. It is just as brutal as Kyle Baker's version, but it's one of the few firsthand accounts of slavery that we have, so it's definitely worth looking through. One of the things I think that's going on here is that Kyle Baker's text is mediated. And what I mean by that is that it can't be a truly historical account of what happened because the text that we have from what happened was preserved by someone else. And what I mean by that is if the first part of mediation is what actually happened, right? What happened in 1931 between Nat and the other slaves and the slave owners, that's first, that's primary. The secondary thing is what Nat Turner told to Thomas Gray while he was imprisoned, which we see at the end of Nat Turner, which we see at the end of the novel, or what Gray recorded and published, because they may not be the same thing. We don't know. We don't know what Nat Turner told him. We don't know if Gray made changes, if he embellished things, if he played down things. We simply can't know, but it seems perfectly reasonable to think that Nat Turner did not have full control over the final version that was published because of his of being incarcerated, right? And then the third level is Kyle Baker's adaptation of Gray's account, right? So we can read this as a really interesting historical source, but its mediation is something I think that Kyle Baker's playing with and something that's really important to his version. So just keep this in mind somewhere in the back of your brain as you read. And I think Kyle Baker also draws attention to this mediation through the style of his work that he chooses to tell in black and white. It's somewhat reminiscent of the contemporary woodcuts. I think this, what showed on the screen right here, is a woodcut. If not, please do email me and correct me. But we see that this is the discovery or Nat Turner being apprehended we see at the end of the novel. And this is a contemporary woodcut that's illustrating what happened, right? So Baker may be trying to reproduce the feel of these contemporary documents, and you can see one that he includes on page 111, for example. So he's showing that here's one account of what happened, like what we see on the screen right here. Nat Turner's giving us, Kyle Baker's giving us another version of what might have happened. But really, what actually happened is probably a little lost to time, but it's still really worthwhile to think about it and to try to reconstruct it because it's such an important moment in history. So why Baker chooses to retell it? I'd encourage you to read the preface to this novel if you haven't already. There he notes that most books don't treat Nat Turner or his rebellion as much as they do other figures, other important figures. And I think he wanted to give us a really visual way of understanding this history and this important figure. He also chose to self-publish the novel, which to me is really important and strikes me as a real reversal of the Confessions of Nat Turner, the 1831 version, because Thomas Gray published that. You know, he had a white intermediary publish that text, whereas Kyle Baker chooses to do it himself. Even though he had worked for Marvel, he had worked for DC, he had worked for the big comics publishers, he could have undoubtedly found someone or a company to publish this, but he chose to do it himself, I think because he wanted to do it his own way, and he wanted to get away from the kind of editorializing that Thomas Gray might have done in the 1831 version. He also chooses to do it as a graphic novel, and that's important, and I'll talk about that next, why I think that's important, rather than telling it as a novel, a short story, whatever. And I think that grows from a really important text that came out in 1987 called Maus, M-A-U-S. Art Spiegelman is the author of this text. It is about Art Spiegelman's father named Vladek and his experiences in the Holocaust as someone who survived Auschwitz. Spiegelman retells his father's experience, and much of the text is called Maus because the different ethnicities and or nationalities are represented as different animals. So the Germans are represented as cats, the Polish people as pigs, and the Americans as dogs, and the Jewish people as mice. And that provides a kind of context, you know, cats and mice fighting the Germans and the Jews, and then the Jewish people being persecuted is obviously a big part of that allegory there. And like Nat Turner, I think what Maus is trying to do is preserve this traumatic history and communicate it in a way that other people will find memorable, meaningful, and will keep it as a subject of conversation and keep it on people's minds throughout history. One thing that Spiegelman tries to do is what he calls witnessing, or what we call witnessing when it comes to historical traumas, is that he wants his readers to see the past, to better imagine it, particularly from the victim's perspective. So this page on the right, if you're interested in Spiegelman's Maus, you should actually read it. But it's all about, there's so much focus on the eyes. And you can see kind of here where we have lots of focus on Vladek's glasses. He wants us to see it how this person sees it. He wants us to provide a context that we could better imagine it, more so than a dry documentary or a dry kind of historical textbook or something like that. He really wants us to see and feel what it felt like from a different perspective. And that's, I think, one of the things that the graphic novel medium allows him to do, is to make us witness in a visual way the atrocities that had happened in the past, right? And the brutality of various systems of subjugation that have happened historically and targeted minorities of all sorts throughout the world. So this is what we often call intertextuality and or allusion, is that I think that Kyle Baker is intentionally alluding to Maus through his stylistic choices, right? Both texts are black and white. Both are really interested in witnessing and sight and bringing things that the violence and the brutality of the past and forcing us to deal with it. Nat Turner tries to reproduce events from Turner's perspective, I think, rather than Gray's. And I think this can be interpreted as a reclamation project, as trying to take back this story and make it part of a history and to assert its importance in history from a perspective that's not from the dominant group, right? So here's some questions that you might ask as you read. Why do you think that this was the perfect story for a comic book, as Baker says? Why do you think he chooses a visual element? Second question, why are there so many references to books? I'll give you some page numbers where that appears. And why do you think they show so much violence in the book, committed by both the slavers and the slave owners? Thanks.